The desert sun bleeds orange across the Sinai Peninsula. June 1967. An Israeli Centurion tank crests a ridge and stops. Below, a column of Soviet-made Egyptian armor stretches toward the horizon. The commander counts 43 vehicles, T-55s. He has seen them in intelligence photographs, but never like this, never in the flesh. His gunner's hands hover over the controls. The range is 1,800 meters, too far for most armies, but not for this crew. Not for the men trained by Israel Tal. The first round screams downrange. A plume of fire erupts from the lead Egyptian tank, then another, and another. Within minutes, the column is shattered, scattered like broken toys across the sand. But here is the thing no one expected. Not every tank was destroyed. Some crews abandoned their vehicles and fled. And when the dust settled, Israeli soldiers climbed into those abandoned machines. They turned the keys. The engines roared to life. That moment changed everything because Israel did not simply capture enemy tanks. They captured an opportunity to understand exactly how the Soviet war machine worked, and more importantly, how to build something better. Welcome to this channel. If you enjoy military history and want to understand the stories behind the greatest weapons ever built, subscribe now. Leave a comment telling me where you are watching from. Your support keeps these deep dives coming. Now let us return to the sands of Sinai and the birth of a revolutionary tank doctrine. The story begins years before the Six-Day War, in a world shaped by the shadows of the Holocaust and the realities of constant existential threat. Israel, a nation smaller than New Jersey, surrounded by hostile neighbors with populations outnumbering its own by tens of millions, faced a fundamental question. How do you survive when your enemies can afford to lose wars, and you cannot afford to lose even one? The answer, for a young officer named Israel Tal, lay in armor, steel, speed, and above all, precision. Israel Tal was not born into military aristocracy. He grew up on a kibbutz in British-controlled Palestine, working the land, learning the value of practical solutions to practical problems. When the Second World War erupted, he joined the British Army, served with the Jewish Brigade, and saw action across Europe. He watched the great armored battles unfold. He saw what tanks could do when properly employed, and he saw what happened when they were not. Those lessons stayed with him when he returned to Palestine and joined the fight for independence in 1948. The War of Independence was chaos. The newly formed Israel Defense Forces fought with whatever they could scrounge: surplus World War II vehicles, improvised armored cars, trucks with steel plates welded to their sides. Tal was a junior officer then, fighting against Arab forces in Jerusalem, in Galilee, and later against Egyptian troops in the south. He learned something crucial in those desperate days. Equipment mattered, yes, but training mattered more. A well-trained crew in an inferior tank could defeat a poorly trained crew in a superior one. That principle would define everything that came after. The years following independence were difficult for the Israeli Armored Corps. The nation had little money and even less access to modern equipment. While Egypt received streams of Soviet hardware, T-34 tanks and IS-3 heavy tanks and modern artillery, Israel scraped together whatever it could buy on the international market. French AMX-13 light tanks, American Shermans left over from the war, British Centurions when the British were willing to sell them. It was a hodgepodge force, and Tal watched it struggle during the 1956 Sinai campaign. That campaign, launched in coordination with Britain and France during the Suez Crisis, revealed both the promise and the problems of Israeli armor. The tanks performed well enough, racing across the desert, capturing key positions, demonstrating the mobility that would become an Israeli hallmark. But Tal saw the flaws. Gunnery was inconsistent. Coordination between units was poor. The Armored Corps was treated as a supporting element, not a decisive one. He believed it should be the spearhead of Israeli military power. He just needed the chance to prove it. That chance came in 1964 when Tal was appointed commander of the Israeli Armored Corps. He was a full colonel by then, an experienced mechanic who understood tanks not just as weapons, but as complex machines that required constant maintenance and skilled operators. He arrived at his new command and immediately stirred controversy. Much to the chagrin of senior officers comfortable with established methods, he demanded wholesale changes, new training regimens, new tactics, new standards of excellence that many thought impossible. The core of Tal's revolution was gunnery. He had observed that tank battles were typically won by whoever fired first and hit first. Soviet doctrine emphasized mass, overwhelming the enemy with numbers. Tal believed Israel could never win that numbers game, so his tanks would have to be more accurate, more lethal, more efficient. He retrained every single gunner in the armored corps to engage and hit targets at ranges beyond 1,500 meters. At the time, this was considered extraordinary. Most armies trained for engagements at far shorter distances. Tal pushed his men further. The training was brutal and relentless. Crews lived in their tanks for weeks at a time. They practiced ranging, leading moving targets, firing on the move. They learned to read terrain, to use hull-down positions where only the turret was exposed while the vulnerable hull remained protected behind a ridge or berm. They studied their machines until they could diagnose problems by sound alone. Tal himself often climbed into tanks to demonstrate techniques, getting his hands dirty alongside his men. He wrote later that the tank is the decisive weapon of land warfare. He intended to prove it. By June 1967, the transformation was complete. When Egypt expelled United Nations peacekeepers from Sinai and massed nearly 100,000 troops and 900 tanks along the Israeli border, the world expected a difficult fight. Egypt had modern Soviet equipment, T-54s and T-55s with powerful 100mm guns. JS-3 heavy tanks with thick armor, self-propelled guns, and artillery in abundance. The Egyptian military had trained with Soviet advisors and adopted Soviet tactics. On paper, they should have had the advantage. But paper does not win wars. When the Israeli Air Force destroyed the Egyptian air arm on the ground in a stunning preemptive strike on June 5th, Tal's armored divisions raced into action. He personally led the 84th Armored Division along the northern axis in Sinai, driving toward the Suez Canal. Alongside him fought divisions commanded by Generals Abraham Yoff and Ariel Sharon, the latter destined to become prime minister decades later. Together, they executed one of the most devastating armored offensives in history. The Egyptian forces crumbled. Israeli gunners, trained to Tal's exacting standards, engaged targets at ranges the Egyptians had never anticipated. T-55s that might have been deadly in close combat were picked off before they could effectively respond. The Israeli crews exploited every advantage their Centurions offered. The depression angle of the main gun was particularly crucial. The Centurion's gun could depress to -10 degrees, allowing it to fire from hull-down positions atop ridges while exposing minimal surface area. The T-55, by contrast, could only depress its gun to -5 degrees. This meant that when Syrian or Egyptian tanks crested a hill to engage, they had to drive forward fully exposed before their guns could bear on targets below. Israeli crews waiting in defilade cut them apart. At the Battle of Abu Agila, Sharon's division executed a masterpiece of combined arms warfare. Infantry cleared trenches, artillery suppressed defensive positions, engineers breached minefields under fire, and when the path was cleared, Israeli armor rolled forward. Centurions and upgraded Shermans engaged Egyptian T-54s and T-55s in fierce close combat, sometimes at ranges of just 10 meters. The Israelis lost 19 tanks. The Egyptians lost 60. More importantly, the road junction at Abu Agila fell into Israeli hands. opening the path into the heart of Sinai. The retreat that followed was catastrophic for Egypt. There was no plan for withdrawal, so units fled independently, abandoning heavy equipment in their panic. Israeli aircraft strafed the retreating columns with napalm. Artillery caught them in the mountain passes. By June 8th, most of Sinai was in Israeli hands, and scattered across the desert, abandoned by their fleeing crews, sat hundreds of tanks, T-54s, T-55s, and the newer T-62s. Enough captured armor to equip 3 mechanized brigades and 2 full armored brigades. The Israelis had won more than a war. They had won a laboratory. This is a natural moment to take a breath from the intensity of battle. If this history is engaging you, if you want more stories like this, consider hitting that subscribe button. Turn on the bell for notifications so you never miss an upload. Now, let us return to 1967 and see what the Israelis discovered inside those captured Soviet machines. The captured T-55s were immediately subjected to rigorous examination. Israeli engineers and intelligence officers crawled over every centimeter of the vehicles, documenting everything they found. The tanks were strange to them, built according to a completely different philosophy. Where Western tanks prioritized crew comfort and efficiency, the Soviet machines sacrificed everything for low profile, high firepower, and mass production. The implications were profound, and they would shape Israeli tank design for generations. To properly understand what the Israelis learned, a joint evaluation program was established with the British. In 1970, a comprehensive report was produced documenting trials conducted on a captured T-55. This document, now declassified from British archives, provides a fascinating window into the Soviet design philosophy and its weaknesses. The findings would directly influence the Merkava tank project that was already taking shape in Israeli minds. The trials examined every aspect of the T-55's weapon system and what the British called its fightability characteristics. The results were mixed. Some elements surprised the Western evaluators. The 100mm gun, for instance, demonstrated ballistic dispersion comparable to Western standards. The rounds flew true. The basic accuracy potential was there. But actually achieving that accuracy in combat was another matter entirely. The gun control system was described as crude. The hand controls did not operate smoothly. Elevation and depression were particularly problematic due to what the evaluators termed excessive gun muzzle preponderance, meaning the barrel-heavy weapon made fine adjustments difficult. Power controls and the stabilizer system were deemed inadequate. Attempts to engage targets while moving with the main gun were essentially futile. The T-55 was a tank designed to stop, aim carefully, and fire from a stationary position. Against Israeli gunners trained to shoot accurately on the move, this was a critical disadvantage. Vision systems told another damning story. The driver and gunner had adequate observation devices for their roles. But the commander, the man responsible for identifying threats and directing the crew, had equipment that British evaluators considered inadequate. His cupola arrangements were of poor quality. They did not compare favorably, the report stated, with the equipment provided for the commander in a Centurion of the 1958 period. Think about that. A tank designed in the early 1960s offered worse command visibility than a British design from a decade earlier. This was not simply about comfort. Tank commanders who cannot see the battlefield cannot make good decisions. They cannot spot threats in time. They cannot coordinate with other units effectively. They cannot exploit opportunities as they emerge. The T-55, for all its menacing reputation, blinded its commanders and left crews fighting half-deaf in a chaotic environment. But the most alarming finding concerned fuel storage. The evaluators were blunt. Fuel storage constitutes a fire hazard. The forward hull fuel tank surrounded 100mm ammunition. Additional fuel was carried in jerry-can-type containers on the right side, track guard, plumbed directly into the fuel system. These external tanks were highly vulnerable to aircraft cannon fire, In fact, they were vulnerable to almost any kind of fire. A single incendiary round in the right place could turn the entire tank into an inferno. Ammunition storage was similarly problematic. Beyond the rounds in the forward hull compartment, about 6 shells were stored above the turret ring on the turret walls, secured by what the evaluators called rather crudely designed clips. The total capacity was 43 rounds, and they were heavy. Loading was awkward, performed left-handed from the right side. In the cramped crew positions, handling these shells quickly was nearly impossible. The result was a very low rate of fire. The overall assessment was harsh. The vehicle is rugged, the report acknowledged. The smoke generation system was excellent, capable of creating dense screens quickly. The armor, for its weight, offered reasonable protection. The silhouette was low and compact, but these advantages could not overcome the fundamental problems. A very low rate of fire combined with a low chance of hitting with the first round constituted, in the evaluators' words, rather poor fightability characteristics. Israeli officers drew their own conclusions from these findings. General Tal, now deeply involved in shaping Israeli military strategy, synthesized what he had learned from combat and from technical evaluation. The T-55 was a dangerous machine in the right circumstances. In mass formations with air cover, against poorly trained opponents, it could be devastating. But against skilled crews with superior gunnery, its weaknesses became fatal. The captured tanks were not merely studied, they were pressed into service. The Israelis designated them T-55, and after modification they joined Israeli armored units. Some retained their original 100mm guns. Others were upgraded with American M68 105mm guns, the same weapon used on Israeli Centurions and Pattons. These upgraded variants were called Tiran 5Sh, the letters standing for Sharir, the Hebrew word for strong. They served alongside their former enemies throughout the following years. Using captured Soviet tanks offered unique advantages. Israeli crews could train against the exact equipment their enemies employed. They understood the T-55's blind spots, its slow rate of fire, its limited depression angle. They knew exactly how long it took an Egyptian or Syrian crew to reload. They knew which angles offered the best protection and which were vulnerable. This intimate knowledge, gained from hands-on experience, proved invaluable when war came again. Because war did come again. October 6, 1973, Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. Israel was caught almost completely by surprise. Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal in massive strength. Syrian armor poured down from the Golan Heights. The comfortable assumptions of 1967 were shattered in hours. The Yom Kippur War was a brutal awakening. Egyptian forces had learned from their humiliation 6 years earlier. They deployed massive quantities of anti-tank guided missiles, particularly the Soviet Sagar system. Infantry teams with portable missiles hid in the sand and ambushed Israeli armor. The tanks that had swept through Sinai in 1967 now found themselves vulnerable in ways they had never anticipated. Israeli counterattacks across the canal suffered devastating losses. Hundreds of tanks were destroyed in the first days. On the Golan Heights, the situation was equally desperate. Syrian tanks, many of them T-55s, and the newer T-62s, advanced under cover of night. They had one crucial advantage: night vision systems. Israeli tanks of that era lacked comparable equipment. In the darkness, Syrian crews could see, while Israeli crews fired blind. The first wave of Syrian armor pushed deep into Israeli territory before dawn, revealed them to defenders who could finally fight back. The battle for the Golan became legendary. Israeli tankers of the 7th Armored Brigade, outnumbered more than 10-1, held a line at the Valley of Tears. They exploited every lesson Tal had taught them: hull-down positions, superior gunnery. the T-55's poor depression angle. When Syrian tanks crested ridges, they were forced to advance into the open before they could engage. Israeli gunners cut them down. But the cost was horrific. Nearly every tank in the defending brigade was destroyed or damaged. The crews fought until their ammunition was exhausted, then fought some more. Israel ultimately won the Yom Kippur War. But the victory felt hollow. The losses were staggering. Hundreds of tanks destroyed, thousands of soldiers dead or wounded. The myth of Israeli invincibility was shattered. And within the Israeli defense establishment, a critical reassessment began. They needed something better. They needed a tank designed from the ground up around the lessons of their wars. This is where the story takes its most significant turn. In the late 1960s, before the Yom Kippur War even began, Israel had been collaborating with the British on the Chieftain tank. 2 prototypes were delivered for a 4-year trial. The plan was for Israel to purchase and domestically produce the vehicle, but politics intervened. Britain was also selling tanks to Arab countries, and the political calculus shifted. The Chieftain sale was canceled. Israel was left without a next-generation tank. The cancellation was devastating, but it also liberated Israeli designers. They were no longer constrained by someone else's priorities. They could build exactly what they needed. In August 1970, a new development program began under Tal's leadership. The project would become the Merkava, Hebrew for chariot, and it would revolutionize tank design. Tal brought to the Merkava everything he had learned in 30 years of armored warfare. From the 1948 War of Independence, he brought the understanding that training trumps technology. From the 1956 and 1967 campaigns, he brought the doctrine of aggressive maneuver and precision gunnery. From the analysis of captured Soviet tanks, he brought intimate knowledge of what not to do. And from the searing losses of 1973, he brought one overriding priority: crew survivability. Every previous tank design had balanced firepower, mobility, and protection in various ways. Different nations emphasized different factors. The Soviets built low, fast tanks with big guns and accepted that crews were expendable. The Germans built balanced machines optimized for European terrain. The Americans built heavy, comfortable tanks with powerful engines. Tal rejected all of these approaches. For Israel, with its tiny population and inability to absorb heavy casualties, the crew had to come first. The most radical decision was placing the engine at the front of the tank. This was almost unprecedented in modern main battle tank design. Conventional wisdom held that the engine should be at the rear, driving the sprockets that moved the tracks. Front-mounted engines complicated the drivetrain, added weight to the forward section, and seemed to serve no purpose. But Tal saw it differently. The engine, he reasoned, was essentially a massive block of metal. If placed in front of the crew compartment, it would absorb incoming rounds. It would act as a shield. Consider what this meant in practice. Most tank casualties came from frontal hits. Enemies aimed for the center mass, for the easiest shot. In a conventional tank, that meant rounds entered the crew compartment first. Even if the armor held, the concussion could be devastating. Spall, fragments of armor blown inward by impact, could maim or eliminate everyone inside. The T-55's fuel tanks surrounding ammunition ensured that penetrating hits often resulted in catastrophic fires. The Merkava inverted this logic. A frontal hit would strike the engine first. The engine might be destroyed, but engines can be replaced. Crews cannot. The human beings inside would be shielded by tons of metal and machinery. They would have a chance to survive, to escape, to fight another day in another tank. In a nation where every soldier mattered, where every family knew someone in uniform, this was not just tactical wisdom. It was moral imperative. The front-mounted engine created another advantage. It opened space at the rear of the tank for a large compartment with a door. Conventional tanks trapped their crews inside. If the vehicle was hit and burning, escape meant climbing through hatches in the turret, exposing yourself to enemy fire, hoping the flames did not catch you first. The Merkava offered something unprecedented: a rear exit. Crews could escape through the back, shielded by the bulk of the tank itself. They could extract wounded comrades. They could even carry infantry in an emergency. This rear compartment transformed the Merkava into something more than a pure tank. In a pinch, it could serve as an armored ambulance. Remove the ammunition racks, and 4 stretchers fit inside. Medics could treat wounded soldiers in the relative safety of the armored hull. It could serve as a command post, with space for additional radios and staff officers. It could carry infantry, 10 soldiers packed tight, protected by armor far thicker than any armored personnel carrier. The ammunition storage system reflected the hard lessons of the T-55 evaluation. Those crude clips holding rounds above the turret ring, the fuel tanks surrounding shells, the fire hazards throughout the Soviet design. None of that would appear in the Merkava. Israeli engineers developed individual fireproof canisters for each round. Even if one shell was hit and detonated, the others would be protected. The chain reaction that turned T-55s into crematoriums would not happen here. The turret design also departed from convention. Most tanks used hydraulic systems to rotate the turret and elevate the gun. These systems were efficient and powerful. They were also filled with flammable hydraulic fluid. A penetrating hit could rupture hydraulic lines, spraying burning liquid throughout the crew compartment. Tal insisted on an electric system. Slower, perhaps, heavier, certainly, but safe. The Merkava would be a dry turret, with no active rounds stored inside and no flammable fluids to catch fire. Armor protection was modular. The T-55 required depot-level maintenance for serious repairs. Damaged armor meant shipping the entire tank back to a factory. The Merkava was designed for battlefield repair. Armor panels could be unbolted and replaced in the field. A tank hit in the morning could be back in action by afternoon. This was not just convenient. It was essential for a small nation facing enemies who could afford to lose equipment and wait for replacements, while Israel could not. The Mark I Merkava entered service in December 1979, 10 years after development began. It weighed 63 tons and mounted the same 105mm gun as upgraded Israeli Centurions and Pattons. The engine was an American-designed Teledyne Continental producing 908 horsepower. Not the fastest tank in the world, perhaps, but the safest. Before we continue into combat, let me pause to say thank you. Thank you for watching, for engaging, for caring about history. If you have not already subscribed, please do so now. It helps this channel grow and tells me that these stories matter to you. Now, let us see how the Merkava performed when theory met reality. The Merkava received its baptism of fire during the 1982 Lebanon War. Israel deployed 180 units into combat against Syrian forces equipped with T-62 tanks and, in some cases, the more modern T-72. The results were striking. The Merkava outperformed Syrian armor consistently. The additional frontal protection proved decisive against the anti-tank weapons of the era, particularly the AT-3 Sagar missile that had caused such devastation in 1973. Syrian gunners and anti-tank teams discovered what Israeli engineers already knew. The Merkava shrugged off hits that would have destroyed other tanks. Rounds that penetrated did less damage because they struck the engine compartment first. Crews survived encounters that would have been fatal in Centurions or Pattons or Soviet-designed machines. The tank worked exactly as Tal had envisioned, but no design is perfect, and combat revealed areas for improvement. The M113 armored personnel carriers accompanying Merkava formations proved vulnerable. They were withdrawn, and Merkavas themselves were converted into makeshift transport vehicles and armored ambulances, proving the versatility of the rear compartment concept. A shot trap was discovered beneath the rear turret bustle, where a well-placed round could jam the turret. Engineers noted this and corrected it in subsequent marks. Chain netting was added behind the turret to detonate rocket-propelled grenades before they could impact primary armor. The 60mm mortar, originally mounted externally and requiring an exposed operator, was redesigned for internal mounting and remote firing. This eliminated a vulnerability that Israeli tankers had first encountered in their Centurion fleet and now permanently solved. Every weakness identified in Lebanon became an improvement in the Mark II, which entered service in April 1983. The evolution continued through the Mark III in 1989 and the Mark IV in 2004. Each generation incorporated lessons from combat and advances in technology. The Mark III received a locally developed 120mm smoothbore gun, substantially increasing firepower. The Mark IV added modular composite armor on all surfaces, including the top, and a V-shaped belly armor pack to protect against mines and improvised explosive devices. The Mark IV also eliminated the loader's hatch in the turret roof. Any aperture increases the risk of penetration, and modern anti-tank guided missiles increasingly attack from above where armor is traditionally thinnest. Israeli designers accepted the inconvenience of a closed turret in exchange for better protection. Every decision, every trade-off came back to that central principle: the crew must survive. The 2006 Lebanon War tested these principles severely. Hezbollah deployed sophisticated anti-tank weapons, including the Russian RPG-29 Vampir, the AT-5 Concurs, the AT-13 Metis-M, and the laser-guided AT-14 Kornet. These represented a generational leap beyond the Sagers of 1973. Over 1,000 missiles were fired during the conflict against Israeli tanks and infantry. The results were sobering. About 45% of tanks and armored vehicles hit by anti-tank guided missiles suffered some form of armor penetration. 15 tank crewmen died from these penetrations. 5 Merkava tanks were destroyed, 2 Mark IIs, 1 Mark III, and 2 Mark IVs. The RPG-29 demonstrated the ability to defeat even the advanced armor of the Mark IV. The Kornet proved particularly deadly. But here is what matters. Compare those numbers to earlier wars. In the Yom Kippur War, an average of 2 crewmen died for every tank penetrated by a missile. In the 1982 Lebanon War, that number dropped to 1.5. In 2006, it fell to 1. The Merkava series, despite facing increasingly lethal weapons, continued to improve crew survival rates. The design philosophy worked. After 2006, the Israeli Defense Forces accelerated development of the Trophy Active Protection System. This system uses radar to detect incoming missiles and rockets, then launches a countermeasure to destroy them before impact. The Merkava Mark IV, equipped with Trophy designated Mark IVM, entered service in 2009. A full brigade of these tanks was declared operational in 2011. The Trophy system had its first operational success in March 2011, when a Merkava Mark IV stationed near the Gaza border successfully defeated a missile attack. During Operation Protective Edge in 2014, no tanks were destroyed. The Trophy system intercepted anti-tank missiles and rocket-propelled grenades on dozens of occasions, including Kornet and Metis-M missiles and RPG-29 rockets. It was, in the words of one Israeli defense official, a breakthrough because it was the first time in military history that an active defense system proved itself in intense fighting. The 401st Brigade, equipped with Merkava Mark IVM tanks, reportedly eliminated between 120 and 130 hostile fighters during the ground fighting phase of Operation Protective Edge. The combination of protection, firepower, and active defense systems made the Merkava more lethal than ever, while maintaining the crew survivability that had always been its defining characteristic. But let us step back from the technology for a moment and consider what this story really means. Because the Merkava is not just a machine. It is an idea made manifest. It is the physical embodiment of a doctrine, a philosophy, a way of thinking about war that emerged from the specific circumstances of a specific nation. When Israeli engineers climbed into those captured T-55s in 1967, they were not just collecting intelligence. They were confronting a fundamental question: what matters most in tank warfare? The Soviet answer was clear: numbers, mass production, simplicity that allowed tanks to be built fast and crewed by conscripts with minimal training. Individual crews were expendable because there were always more where they came from. The tank was a weapon, a tool, a piece of equipment to be used and discarded. Tal rejected this philosophy absolutely. Israel could not afford to think of its soldiers as expendable. Every lost crew represented not just military capability, but families destroyed, communities diminished, a nation wounded in ways that went beyond tactics and strategy. The tank, in Tal's vision, was not just a weapon. It was a home for 4 soldiers. Their lives were precious. The machine existed to protect them while they did their job. This philosophy extended beyond the Merkava itself. Tal's gunnery training revolution was fundamentally about crew efficiency. A crew that could engage and destroy enemies at long range faced fewer threats than one that had to close to short range, where every exchange became a coin flip. Superior training was protection. Superior tactics were protection. The Merkava's armor was just the final layer in a system designed to bring soldiers home alive. The captured T-55s taught Israeli engineers what happened when this philosophy was ignored. Cramped crew compartments that made efficient operation nearly impossible. Fuel storage that turned minor hits into fatal fires. Ammunition handling that slowed rate of fire and reduced effectiveness. Commander visibility so poor that half the battlefield remained invisible. Every weakness in the Soviet design stemmed from prioritizing other factors over the human beings inside. The Merkava addressed each of these failures systematically. Crew compartments were sized for efficiency, not minimal silhouette. Fuel and ammunition were stored safely, separated from crew spaces, protected by fireproof containers. The commander received excellent observation equipment, giving him full awareness of his surroundings. The rate of fire improved because loaders could actually move in their spaces. Everything served the crew, and the crew, trained to Tal's exacting standards, made the machine effective. A Merkava in the hands of a poorly trained crew would still be dangerous, but in the hands of gunners trained to hit at 1,500 meters and beyond, commanders trained to read terrain and exploit advantages, drivers trained to position their vehicles optimally, the Merkava became devastating. The tank and the Doctrine were inseparable. Each reinforced the other. This integration of technology and doctrine is perhaps the most important lesson of the Israeli tank experience. Neither alone is sufficient. The Soviet Union built millions of tanks but could not match Israeli effectiveness because their doctrine did not emphasize individual crew excellence. Western nations built sophisticated machines but often lacked the combat experience to develop optimal employment concepts. Israel, forced by circumstance to do more with less, found the synthesis. The captured T-55s played a role in this synthesis that extended beyond technical analysis. Israeli crews trained against them, learning to defeat them through direct experience. Israeli instructors could point to specific weaknesses and explain exactly how to exploit them. When war came, Israeli tankers faced enemies they understood intimately. They knew the T-55 needed to crest hills and advance before its gun could depress enough to engage. They knew its rate of fire was slow. They knew its commander was half-blind. This knowledge saved lives. The T-55 variants that served in Israeli units provided additional benefits. Crews rotated through them, experiencing Soviet ergonomics firsthand. Officers understood exactly what challenges enemy tank commanders faced. This informed tactical planning at every level. When Israeli forces engaged Syrian armor on the Golan Heights or Egyptian armor in Sinai, they were fighting opponents they understood better than those opponents understood themselves. Modern warfare continues to validate these lessons. The conflict that began in October 2023 has seen extensive use of Merkava tanks in urban combat, a role for which the platform was adapted through the Merkava LIC variant. Low-intensity conflict modifications added a turret-mounted 12.7 mm coaxial machine gun for engaging dismounted threats without using the main gun. Metal mesh protects sensitive optics and ventilators from explosive charges. Rear-facing cameras and navigation aids assist in the confined spaces of urban environments. But no tank is invulnerable. Reports indicate that hostile forces have occasionally managed to damage or destroy Merkavas using combinations of improvised explosive devices, anti-tank missiles, and increasingly, unmanned aerial systems dropping shaped charge munitions. The trophy system, designed to defeat incoming missiles, faces new challenges from drone attacks that it was not originally configured to counter. Israeli forces have adapted by adding slat armor above turrets to detonate munitions before they reach primary armor. The tank shortage that has emerged from extended combat operations demonstrates another truth that Tal understood. Wars consume equipment at rates peacetime planners often underestimate. Israel reportedly faces shortages of both tanks and tank ammunition after sustained fighting. This is not a failure of the Merkava design. It is a reminder that even the best equipment is finite, and conflicts have costs that cannot be entirely engineered away. Yet the fundamental principles remain sound. Crews are surviving encounters that would have been fatal in earlier generations of tanks. The emphasis on protection and survivability continues to pay dividends measured in human lives. When a Merkava is destroyed, the rear door often allows crews to escape. When a Merkava is damaged, modular armor allows rapid repair. When systems fail, redundancy ensures continued function. The philosophy that Tal articulated half a century ago still guides Israeli tankers today. The influence has spread beyond Israel. The United States military studied Trophy after its demonstrated success and adopted similar active protection systems for American armored vehicles. The front-mounted engine concept, once considered radical, has influenced designs in several nations. Modular armor, which the Merkava pioneered, is now standard across modern main battle tanks. The emphasis on crew survivability that seemed uniquely Israeli has become universal doctrine. General Israel Tal died in September 2010 at the age of 85. He never held the position of Chief of Staff, politics having cost him that appointment in the early 1970s. But his legacy is more durable than any rank or title. The Merkava, now in its fourth major generation with the Mark IV Barak, carries forward his vision. Over 2,000 of these tanks have been built since 1979. They remain the backbone of the Israeli Armored Corps, the physical expression of lessons learned in the sands of Sinai and the valleys of the Golan. The story of the captured T-55 and the better tank doctrine that emerged from studying it is ultimately a story about learning, about refusing to accept that the way things have always been done is the way they must continue, about looking at enemy equipment not with contempt, but with genuine curiosity. What did they get right? What did they get wrong? What can we learn? Israel's enemies provided, in those abandoned tanks scattered across Sinai, the seeds of their own future defeats. The T-55 was a formidable weapon that, properly employed in mass formations with adequate support, could have overwhelmed Israeli defenses. But it was also a machine with fundamental flaws that Israeli engineers identified, documented, and learned to exploit. The Merkava was designed to avoid every weakness, to incorporate every strength, to be something genuinely new rather than merely another iteration of conventional thinking. This is what makes military history fascinating. Not the clash of armies as abstract forces, but the human decisions that shaped those clashes. Israel Tal chose to retrain his gunners when others said the standards were impossible. Israeli engineers chose to put the engine in front when convention said it belonged in back. Israeli doctrine emphasized crew survival when other nations accepted crew losses as inevitable costs. These choices made history. The young soldier who climbed into that abandoned T-55 in June 1967, who started the engine and discovered it still ran, could not have imagined what would follow. He was probably just looking for a souvenir or maybe transportation back to friendly lines. But that captured tank, and hundreds like it, became the foundation for a revolution in armor warfare. From enemy machines came intimate understanding. From understanding came new doctrine. From doctrine came the Merkava. From the Merkava came generations of soldiers who went home to their families because someone cared enough about their survival to redesign war itself around keeping them alive. Thank you for watching this entire documentary. If you made it this far, you are clearly passionate about military history, and I am grateful for your attention. Subscribe to the channel if you want more content like this. Share this video with friends who might appreciate it. Leave a comment letting me know what topics you would like to see explored in future episodes. Until next time, remember that behind every weapon are the human beings who built it, who crewed it, and who ultimately determined whether it became a footnote or a legend. The Merkava is a legend, born from captured Soviet steel and the determination of one nation to never again count its tank crews among the expendable.